stepping into the abyss of tragedy, the 9/11 attack on the morning of September 11th, 2001, the clear blue skies over New York City were suddenly torn apart. What began as a typical weekday quickly turned into an unimaginable catastrophe. At around 8:46 a.m., as many Americans were starting their workday, the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact sent shockwaves through the city. Buildings trembled, windows shattered, and a thick cloud of smoke rose up into the sky. People on the streets below could only look up in disbelief, unable to fathom the horror that was unfolding before them. Just 17 minutes later, as if time had stopped, another plane, United Airlines Flight 175, slammed into the South Tower. This second attack confirmed the unthinkable. The first crash was no accident, but a deliberate, coordinated assault on one of the most iconic landmarks of American power and commerce. The world was now witnessing the collapse of America's sense of invulnerability. Within moments, the entire city was thrust into chaos, with sirens blaring, people running in every direction, and a sense of impending doom settling over the streets. The Twin Towers, symbols of American strength and resilience, were now burning. As both towers collapsed in less than 2 hours, raining debris down upon the streets below, the entire nation stood still. The world watched as New York's skyline was forever altered, but the destruction wasn't limited to the towers alone. The terror didn't end there. At the same time, a third plane, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., further shattering the sense of security that had once been a cornerstone of American life. In the midst of this growing chaos, another plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was hijacked. But in a heroic act of defiance, the passengers aboard fought back, preventing the plane from reaching its intended target. That plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, but not before these courageous individuals saved countless lives in Washington, D.C. In the span of just a few hours, the United States had experienced the largest and deadliest terrorist attack in its history. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost that day, and the ripples of grief, anger, and confusion spread far beyond the immediate victims. For Americans, September 11th was not just a tragedy, it was a defining moment, one that shattered the illusion of safety that had long been taken for granted. It was a day that changed the course of history and altered the trajectory of the nation, both in terms of its foreign policy and its relationship with the rest of the world. As the dust settled, the country stood in shock and mourning. But beneath the grief, there was also a growing sense of determination and unity, a resolve to respond, rebuild, and ensure that such an atrocity would never happen again. However, this moment of collective strength would eventually give way to new challenges, as the consequences of the attacks would ripple out in unexpected ways for years to come. The aftermath of September 11th would not only change how America viewed terrorism, but also how it saw itself in the global arena. And so, what began as a day of devastation would mark the beginning of an era defined by global conflict, heightened security, and an ongoing quest to understand the depths of such a profound tragedy. The echo of September 11th reverberated through every corner of the country, leaving an indelible imprint on the hearts and minds of every American and the world at large. Detailed description of the attacks on the morning of September 11th, 2001, at around 8:46 a.m., while the sun was shining on New York City, no one could have imagined that a horrific event was about to unfold. American Airlines Flight 11, carrying 92 passengers, had been hijacked by Al-Qaeda operatives. After taking control of the plane, the hijackers aimed it straight at the North Tower of the World Trade Center, WTC. The moment the plane collided with the tower, a massive explosion of fire and smoke erupted, shaking the building and sending a shockwave of horror through everyone nearby. The impact caused the shattered glass from the tower to rain down on the streets below, and people inside began scrambling to escape. But the smoke and fire quickly blocked many exits. The sheer scale of the devastation left people in disbelief. It was clear that this wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate attack. As the emergency response began, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Less than 20 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., another plane, United Airlines Flight 175, carrying 65 passengers, appeared in the sky. It was headed straight for the South Tower of the WTC. The crash was violent, and a huge fireball erupted upon impact, sending another wave of panic throughout the city. The impact caused the South Tower to shake violently, and just like its twin, it was soon engulfed in flames. The images were horrific. Both of New York's tallest towers were now on fire, with people trapped inside and desperate to escape. At this moment, New York City seemed to be in a state of sheer chaos. People raced to flee from the area, but it wasn't easy to move quickly as the smoke filled the air, blocking visibility and choking the streets. Firefighters and rescue teams rushed to the scene, but the scale of the disaster was beyond anyone's expectation. Meanwhile, those inside the towers fought to survive as best they could, but with elevators out of order and stairwells filled with smoke, many were trapped. By now, it was clear that this was not just an accident, it was an all-out attack. But the horror was far from over. At 9:37 a.m., another hijacked plane, American Airlines Flight 77, appeared on radar. This plane, too, was heading straight for its target, the Pentagon, the heart of the U.S. military in Arlington, Virginia. When the plane slammed into the building, the impact was deafening and a huge fireball erupted, engulfing the west side of the Pentagon. The explosion sent shockwaves through the surrounding area, and the iconic building, despite its size and military importance, was severely damaged. As the disaster unfolded, it was not just the physical destruction that stunned people. It was the realization that this was part of a larger, coordinated effort to strike at the core of American power. But the final blow that the hijackers had hoped to deliver was thwarted by the bravery of the passengers aboard United Airlines Flight 93. This flight, originally headed for Washington, D.C., was hijacked as well. However, when the passengers on board learned of the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, they decided to fight back. In a desperate, courageous struggle, they tried to overpower the hijackers, preventing them from reaching their intended target, likely the White House or the U.S. Capitol. The plane eventually crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing all on board, but they prevented what would have been an even more devastating attack. Within just 3 hours, 4 hijacked planes, 3 collapsing towers, and thousands of lives lost transformed the United States and the world forever. The country that was once considered a symbol of strength and security was now reeling from a terrorist attack of unprecedented magnitude. The Twin Towers, once symbols of economic power and global influence, were reduced to a pile of rubble, and nearly 3,000 innocent people lost their lives in an attack they could never have foreseen. This was the tragic reality of September 11th, 2001, a day that changed not only the lives of those directly affected, but the entire course of modern history. It was a day of unimaginable loss, but also a day that showed the world the resilience, courage, and determination of ordinary people in the face of terror. Evidence that has been published. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the United States government, alongside law enforcement agencies, began the daunting task of gathering evidence to understand the scope and scale of what had just occurred. What they uncovered over the following months and years was a disturbing picture of a carefully orchestrated attack that had been years in the making. The public release of evidence not only illuminated the terrifying precision behind the attacks, but also set the stage for the war on terror that would unfold. The first pieces of the puzzle were scattered across the attack sites themselves. At Ground Zero, in the wreckage of the World Trade Center, investigators found flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders. These black boxes were vital in reconstructing the events of the hijackings. They revealed chilling details: how the hijackers had calmly taken control of the aircraft, how the passengers on Flight 93 had tried to retake the plane, and, most hauntingly, the voices of the hijackers themselves calmly discussing their mission in the final moments before the crashes. A critical breakthrough came in November 2001 when authorities began to uncover the identities of the hijackers. Through detailed analysis of flight manifests, visa applications, and bank records, investigators confirmed that the hijackers were members of Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization led by Osama bin Laden. Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the group, was identified as one of the hijackers who piloted American Airlines Flight 11 into the North Tower. His passport, found miraculously intact in the wreckage of the crash site, was later shown to authorities. This single piece of evidence became symbolic, as it marked the first major clue linking Al-Qaeda directly to the attack. Further investigation revealed that bin Laden and his associates had spent months meticulously planning the assault. They had traveled across multiple countries, receiving training in aviation and bomb-making techniques from Al-Qaeda's training camps. Some hijackers even went so far as to train at US flight schools, learning how to control aircraft in preparation for their mission. Meanwhile, another significant piece of evidence was found in the Pentagon wreckage. Investigators recovered documents and personal belongings from the hijackers who had crashed American Airlines Flight 77 into the building. These belongings provided further confirmation that the hijackers had meticulously planned each attack, even down to the locations they would target and the routes they would take. In the weeks following the attacks, intelligence agencies around the world began to sift through mountains of intercepted communications, emails, and phone calls. They discovered that Al-Qaeda operatives had been communicating for months, even years, in a coordinated effort to carry out these simultaneous attacks. These communications were crucial in understanding the scale of the plot. The attackers had been trained, organized, and armed with one goal in mind: to strike a blow against the US on its own soil. However, the most chilling discovery came with the release of intelligence reports suggesting that bin Laden had personally approved the operation. In various interviews and through captured messages, it was revealed that Osama bin Laden had openly admitted to planning the attacks. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was a video found in Afghanistan in which bin Laden directly referenced the attacks, acknowledging his involvement and even expressing pleasure at the devastation it had caused. As the evidence mounted, so did the public's sense of disbelief and horror. The realization that such an attack had been planned for years by a global network of extremists with precise and methodical preparation sent shockwaves through America and the world. The evidence, pieced together from flight manifests, physical remains, intercepted communications, and bin Laden's own admissions, painted a clear and undeniable picture of the terror orchestrated by Al-Qaeda. Beyond these immediate findings, the US government and intelligence agencies began to review past intelligence and operations, searching for any overlooked warnings. It was uncovered that in the months leading up to September 11th, there had been numerous warnings about Al-Qaeda's plans to strike inside the US, but those warnings had not been fully acted upon due to a lack of coordination among various agencies. The 9/11 Commission report, released in 2004, detailed these findings and laid out a timeline of events leading up to the attacks. It was a comprehensive account of how the hijackers were able to carry out their mission with relative ease despite the warnings that were scattered across US intelligence. The Commission's investigation uncovered disturbing truths about the breakdowns in communication between agencies like the CIA, FBI, and NSA, which was supposed to be preventing such an attack from happening. In addition to the physical evidence, video footage from the attacks provided an indelible image of the horror that unfolded on that fateful day. The iconic scenes of the planes crashing into the towers, the subsequent collapse of both buildings, and the smoke and ash that filled the sky are images forever etched in the minds of millions. These images, combined with the first-hand accounts of survivors and witnesses, have remained a powerful source of evidence that captured the scale of the tragedy and the profound impact it had on the nation. Through these various forms of evidence, physical remains, intelligence documents, and media, the truth behind the September 11th attacks has been unveiled. What started as an unimaginable act of terrorism was soon proven to be the result of years of meticulous planning by an extremist organization determined to inflict catastrophic damage. As these pieces of evidence continued to surface, they painted a vivid and haunting picture of the precision and audacity behind the attack, forever changing the way Americans and the world viewed security, intelligence, and the reality of global terrorism. Long-term impact on the United States. The events of September 11th, 2001 didn't just shake the foundations of New York City or Washington, D.C. They reverberated throughout the entire United States, forever altering the nation's landscape. It was a day of horror, yes, but it was also a day that gave birth to a new era in American history, one marked by heightened security measures, global warfare, and a significant shift in the American psyche. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, the nation's response was swift. President George W. Bush, standing before a stunned nation, vowed that the United States would not be cowed. "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them," he declared. That speech marked the beginning of what would be known as the War on Terror, an all-encompassing global campaign that would reshape American foreign policy and national security for decades to come. In the weeks following the attacks, it felt as though the entire country was on edge. Airports, once bustling hubs of convenience and efficiency, now became fortresses. Security screenings became invasive and intense, with long lines of passengers nervously watching as their bags were scanned and their bodies were probed. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, was formed in the aftermath of the attacks, completely transforming the way air travel was conducted. New protocols were put in place, like the ban on liquids in carry-on luggage, and travelers were forced to arrive hours early to accommodate the new slow-paced security checks. For Americans, these changes to daily life felt like the first physical manifestation of the attack's psychological toll. No longer could citizens walk into airports without having their bags thoroughly searched, or board a plane without being scanned for explosives. Each time a plane took off, there was an ever-present reminder of the devastating terrorist hijackings. The threat of future attacks seemed constant, creating a society where everyday routines were now filtered through a lens of uncertainty and fear. The United States' shift in foreign policy was just as dramatic. The immediate reaction was to target al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. Within weeks, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a military campaign aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and ousting the Taliban from Afghanistan. The mission that began in Afghanistan soon expanded to other parts of the world as the US fought to eliminate terrorist cells and prevent future attacks. However, as time went on, it became clear that the war on terror was not going to be a quick or easy victory. The Iraq War, launched in 2003, further exacerbated the country's military entanglements. The decision to invade Iraq, based on suspicions that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, was controversial, and its aftermath would have deep and long-lasting consequences. For many Americans, the war felt like an extension of the trauma of 9/11, a continuation of a fight against enemies abroad that, while necessary for national security, came at an enormous human and financial cost. The Iraq War led to thousands of American casualties, the creation of new terrorist groups like ISIS, and a rising sense of disillusionment among many Americans who began to question the long-term benefits of such a prolonged military engagement. Meanwhile, domestically, the US government introduced measures that expanded its reach into the private lives of citizens. The Patriot Act, passed just 6 weeks after 9/11, gave the government sweeping powers to monitor and surveil individuals in the name of a national security. The government could now access private records, conduct wiretaps without a warrant, and even detain individuals indefinitely without charges. For many, the Patriot Act represented a dangerous erosion of civil liberties. It sparked an ongoing debate about the balance between security and freedom. The loss of privacy and the unchecked power of surveillance left many Americans feeling vulnerable in new, unsettling ways. While these policies reshaped national security, the emotional and psychological scars left by the attacks were just as profound. In the years following September 11th, a wave of nationalism swept across the United States. Flags were flown from every building, and the slogan, "Never Forget," became a common phrase in the country's collective consciousness. The attack sparked a sense of unity among Americans, but also fear that they were no longer living in an invulnerable nation. Patriotism surged, but so did anxiety. Many felt the need to be constantly vigilant, uncertain if their next day would be interrupted by another terrorist attack. In the aftermath, it was clear that the attacks had altered American culture in ways that were not always immediately visible. The heightened fear of terrorism led to a rise in Islamophobia, as some Americans began to associate Islam with violence and extremism. Mosques were vandalized, and Muslim Americans found themselves unfairly targeted, experiencing a rise in hate crimes and discrimination. The narrative of us versus them that emerged after September 11th cast a long shadow, leaving deep divisions in the American social fabric. At the same time, September 11th served as a catalyst for technological innovation in areas related to national security. The rise of surveillance technologies, social media platforms, and intelligence sharing networks all accelerated in the years that followed as the government sought to stay one step ahead of terrorist organizations. But this technological revolution wasn't without its challenges. New threats, new forms of communication, and cyber attacks have since become a growing concern for the US government. One of the most significant long-term effects of 9/11 was on the American identity itself. The tragic loss of life and the monumental destruction caused by the attacks left an indelible mark on the collective psyche. The loss of the Twin Towers, symbols of American economic power, was symbolic of a broader loss of innocence. For many, it was the first time they truly realized that America was vulnerable, that no one, no matter how strong, was impervious to the reach of terrorism. As we look back today, the impact of September 11th still lingers. It is felt in the way America approaches foreign policy, in the way airports function, and in the way we view threats to national security. The war on terror has become a defining feature of early 21st century geopolitics, and the legacy of the attacks has shaped a generation of Americans who grew up with a constant awareness of the fragile nature of peace. The events of September 11th did not just change the United States, they redefined the way the nation would see itself, the world, and the threats that loom over it. More than 2 decades later, the shadow of that day still hangs over American society, altering how it navigates its place in the world and how it deals with the ever-present threat of global terrorism. The story of September 11th and the impacts it had on the United States is still being written, and it will continue to unfold for generations to come. Rumors and dramatic conspiracy theories. As the dust settled after the attacks and the nation began to pick up the pieces, a different narrative started to unfold, one not driven by facts and evidence, but by speculation and fear. For some, the trauma of September 11th was too much to bear without looking for alternative explanations, and rumors began to swirl. These weren't just idle whispers in the dark, they were full-fledged conspiracy theories that challenged the official account of what had happened. These theories found fertile ground in a world already shaken by the enormity of the events. One of the most pervasive and dramatic conspiracy theories that emerged was the idea of inside involvement. According to this theory, the US government, or at least a faction within it, had either allowed the attacks to happen or actively orchestrated them to serve as a pretext for waging war in the Middle East and increasing control over its own citizens. This narrative, often referred to as the inside job theory, was a fuel for intense debates, with many individuals across the world, especially in the early 2000s, insisting that the events of 9/11 were not just a foreign attack, but a planned operation by the US itself. One of the key points raised by these theorists was the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. According to official reports, the towers collapsed due to the structural damage caused by the hijacked planes and the subsequent fires. However, some conspiracy theorists, including architects and engineers, questioned the collapse. They argued that the way the buildings fell, almost symmetrically, resembled the way controlled demolitions were conducted. Some even speculated that explosives had been planted within the buildings long before the planes struck, causing the towers to collapse in on themselves in a way that was seemingly too perfect to be the result of a fire. The evidence cited by these theorists included eyewitness reports that claimed to have heard explosions in the moments before or after the planes crashed into the buildings. These reports painted a picture of a calculated destruction where something other than the impact of the planes was involved. While debunked by experts, the theory of controlled demolition spread like wildfire, especially in the early days of the internet, where forums and websites became breeding grounds for alternative narratives. It was a theory that fed on the idea that powerful entities within the government might have had something to gain from the destruction of the towers. Then came another explosive theory, the Pentagon attack. According to this theory, the official story that American Airlines Flight 77 had crashed into the Pentagon was false. Some skeptics argued that the damage to the Pentagon could not have been caused by a commercial airliner. The damage, they claimed, was too small and too contained to be the result of such a large aircraft. They suggested that a missile, not a plane, had struck the Pentagon. This theory gained traction among people who questioned the photographic evidence and felt that the government was hiding something about the scale of the attack. The lack of clear footage from security cameras in the immediate aftermath only fueled their suspicions. Why, they asked, was there no clear visual evidence showing the plane as it approached the Pentagon? The flight path of American Airlines Flight 77 was also questioned. Conspiracy theorists pointed to the sharp turn the plane took just before hitting the Pentagon, suggesting that such a maneuver would have been impossible for an inexperienced hijacker to perform. Some went further, proposing that the plane crash was somehow staged and that the real target of the attack might have been something else entirely. While these theories spread, another set of suspicions emerged concerning the role of Israel and its intelligence agency, Mossad, in the attacks. A popular conspiracy theory suggested that Israeli intelligence officers had foreknowledge of the attacks and deliberately withheld information from the US government in order to help advance their own agenda in the Middle East. Proponents of this theory cited claims that a group of Israeli agents posing as art students had been seen near the World Trade Center in the days leading up to 9/11, and that they were somehow connected to the hijackers. While these claims were later debunked, the story continued to circulate, playing into a broader narrative of shadowy forces orchestrating the tragedy for their own benefit. Moreover, some conspiracy theorists pointed to the financial markets, speculating that the events of 9/11 were used to further consolidate wealth and enrich certain corporate interests. The theory went that stock market manipulation had been involved, with insiders having knowledge of the impending attacks and betting against certain companies, especially airlines and insurance firms. This led to the theory that the attacks were, at least in part, economically motivated. These dramatic conspiracy theories sparked intense reactions, but they were met with sharp skepticism from the majority. Over time, experts from various fields, including architecture, aviation, and intelligence, offered counter-arguments and explanations, debunking many of the key claims. The 9/11 Commission report itself, published in 2004, provided an exhaustive, fact-based account of the attacks, dismantling many of these theories with detailed evidence and research. Yet, despite the official findings, the conspiracy theories continue to resonate with certain sections of the public. They grew in complexity, incorporating new angles such as the military-industrial complex's supposed role in enabling the attacks for profit, or the notion that the US government had intentionally ignored warnings in order to allow the attacks to unfold. These theories were often portrayed as counter-narratives to what some perceived as a controlled mainstream media, reinforcing the idea that the truth behind 9/11 was far more complex and far darker than anyone could imagine. While none of these dramatic theories have been definitively proven, and many have been thoroughly debunked, they remain part of the cultural landscape surrounding September 11th. They serve as a reminder of the human need to understand and make sense of a world that was suddenly filled with chaos and uncertainty. The unanswered questions about the attacks continue to haunt some, feeding into the suspicion that there are truths yet to be uncovered, or that certain parties are still hiding vital information from the public. In the end, these conspiracy theories represent more than just a desire to explain the events of September 11th. They reflect a deeper fear that the official narrative may not be the whole truth, and that the real reasons behind the attacks might be even more disturbing than anyone is willing to admit. They remain a testament to the complexity of historical events and the way in which truth and rumor can intertwine, making it difficult for anyone, conspiracy theorists or skeptics alike, to reach a final, definitive answer. The lasting echo of September 11th, the events of September 11th, 2001, left an indelible mark on the fabric of America, one that continues to shape not just the physical landscape, but the very way people think, feel, and live. As the dust settled on Ground Zero, what remained was not just the wreckage of buildings, but the remnants of an entire worldview that had been shattered, leaving the American public to confront a new reality, one filled with uncertainty, fear, and a profound loss of innocence. In the days that followed, the unimaginable scale of the attack sunk in. Lives were lost, entire families were torn apart, and the nation found itself grieving for those it had never met. But beyond the immediate tragedy, the attacks marked a turning point in American history. The collective spirit of the country, forged in the fires of the Great Depression and World War II, was tested in ways few could have imagined. The unity that emerged in the wake of the attacks was both raw and temporary. Americans, bound by shared grief and a desire for justice, stood together in ways not seen in decades. Flags flew high, slogans like "Never Forget" became mantras, and people reached out to one another in compassion, trying to make sense of the madness that had unfolded. But the unity that emerged post-September 11th would not last forever. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the national psyche began to evolve. The wounds were deep, but they were also politicized. As the nation found itself embroiled in the war on terror, the Bush administration, in its drive to secure America and take revenge for the horrors of 9/11, made decisions that would ripple through the years to come. Decisions that divided the country and altered the political landscape. The invasion of Iraq, the establishment of the Patriot Act, and the expansion of the NSA's surveillance programs became key symbols of a nation grappling with the need for security at the cost of individual freedoms. While some applauded these efforts as necessary to prevent further attacks, others saw them as excessive, an overreaction that violated the very principles America was founded upon. As the war on terror progressed, the physical and psychological toll on American soldiers and citizens alike became clear. Thousands of lives were lost overseas in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and millions of people lived in a constant state of fear, wondering when the next attack might come. The specter of terrorism loomed large, casting a shadow over daily life. Airports became fortresses with invasive security measures that felt like a new normal, and public spaces that once felt safe were now vulnerable to the ever-present threat of violence. This pervasive sense of fear eventually began to erode the very freedoms that the country had held dear, but perhaps the most profound impact of 9/11 was the way it changed the American identity itself. The nation that had once prided itself on being a global beacon of freedom and opportunity began to see itself through a different lens, one shaped by the fear of foreign threats, the loss of innocence, and the recognition that the world was no longer as predictable as it once had been. This feeling wasn't limited to just the political elite. It permeated every level of society. The rise of Islamophobia, the xenophobic fears about immigrants, and the growing divide between the US and much of the world all stemmed from a single tragic day. And as the years passed, the anger that once brought the country together slowly morphed into division, a division that we continue to see today. For many, the healing process was long and painful. Memorials like the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York serve as somber reminders of the lives lost and the lessons learned, but no monument can truly encapsulate the emotional scars left behind by the attacks. The psychological toll was immense, families torn apart, lives forever changed, and an entire generation of Americans left with a deep sense of uncertainty about the world around them. Many of those directly affected, first responders, survivors, and their families continue to struggle with the aftermath, dealing with everything from physical ailments caused by exposure to toxic debris to the mental health impacts of trauma that may never fully heal. Yet despite all the tragedy, there is also a sense of resilience that defines America's response to 9/11. The rebuilding efforts after the attacks, both physically in the reconstruction of the Twin Towers site and emotionally in the way the country came together, showcased the determination and strength of the American spirit. The flagging economy rebounded, and while the war on terror led to further conflicts, it also fostered a renewed sense of unity during those early years after the attacks. America, in many ways, found a new purpose: to protect its people at all costs, to seek justice for the lives lost, and to ensure that such a tragedy would never occur again on its soil. But even as America's strength and resolve were put to the test, the emotional toll continued to leave its mark. The attacks didn't just reshape policy, they reshaped the heart and soul of the nation. The deeply embedded fear of terrorism and the surveillance state that grew out of it altered the way Americans interacted with their government, their neighbors, and the world. As the years passed, the question of what 9/11 truly meant and how to reconcile its legacy became an issue that transcended politics and ideology. Was it a call to arms, a reminder of American exceptionalism, or was it a warning that the world had changed and with it, the very concept of safety? In closing, the legacy of September 11th is one of immense complexity. It is both a national tragedy and a moment of transformation, one that left the nation forever scarred, but also determined to move forward. America's journey since that fateful day has been one of grief, growth, and grappling with the new reality of a world that can change in the blink of an eye. While the memory of September 11th will always be part of America's story, so too will be the enduring spirit of resilience, a spirit that continues to guide the country through its darkest days. The attacks may have taken so much from America, but they also help forge a nation that refuses to be defined by its pain, instead choosing to push forward, seeking justice and hoping for a future where such a tragedy never happens again. Never forget, but also never surrender.